Meaning Mondays, Chapter 2 of Maps of Meaning, and we're getting into an interesting section that's going to talk about the Metaphorical Universe, and a part that reminds me of Owen Benjamin. We're starting on page 20, and we're moving all the way to page 23, partly because I'm trying to make up for lost time, and partly because this section I think needs to be read all at once to take it all in. Can't really be split up that well. So I'll start midway down page 20. Normal and Revolutionary Life. Two Prosaic Stories. We tell ourselves stories about who we are, where we would like to be, and how we are going to get there. These stories regulate our emotions by determining the significance of all the things we encounter and all the events we experience. We regard things that get us on our way as positive, things that impede our progress as negative, and things that do neither as irrelevant. Most things are irrelevant, and that is a good thing, as we have limited attentional resources. Inconveniences interfere with our plans. We do not like inconveniences and will avoid dealing with them. Nonetheless, they occur commonly, so commonly, in fact, that they might be regarded as an integral, predictable, and constant feature of the human environment. We have adapted to this feature and have the intrinsic resources to cope with inconveniences. We benefit, become stronger in doing so. Ignored inconveniences accumulate rather than disappear. When they accumulate in sufficient numbers, they produce a catastrophe, a self-induced catastrophe to be sure, but one that may be indistinguishable from an act of God. Inconveniences interfere with the integrity of our plans, so we tend to pretend that they are not there. Catastrophes, by contrast, interfere with the integrity of our whole stories and massively dysregulate our emotions. By their nature, they are harder to ignore, although that does not stop us from trying to do so. Inconveniences are common, unfortunately so are catastrophes, self-induced and otherwise. We are adapted to catastrophes like inconveniences as constant environmental features. We can resolve catastrophes just as we can cope with inconvenience, although at a higher cost. As a consequence of this adaptation, this capacity for resolution, catastrophe can rejuvenate. It can also destroy. This reminds me of what's been going on with Owen Benjamin for the past year and a half or so. You know, his world has been turned upside down several times, and so black has become white and white has become black. His heroes are now his villains, roughly speaking. And I think he said he doubts everything he once held to be true, and that it's healthy to do so. You can just refer to my Owen Benjamin was right about the moon landing for what I think about that. You can see how his emotions have been massively dysregulated, and how he's in the state of chaos that Jordan once described, using the example of a man walking in on his wife cheating on him. All of a sudden, everything he knew in his life had to be questioned because that was the surest thing, the love that his wife had for him. And now that's been turned upside down. So, what else has he been missing? And so, likewise, if you're reading along here and you're an Owen Benjamin fan, that might be really salient to you, that, what's going on in his life. Of course, we all go through this. As Peterson says, this is common in our environment. We're adapted to it. But our little catastrophes, or big catastrophes for that matter, are not seen in public, whereas Owen is sort of sharing everything in his life to the public. That's why it's kind of so interesting that way. I guess we can't help but be interested on some level with that. Anyway, back to Maps of Meaning. The more ignored inconveniences in a given catastrophe, the more likely it will destroy. Okay. You don't want inconveniences to accumulate, I guess, right? Enough has been learned in the last half-century of inquiry into intellectual and emotional function to enable the development of provisional general theory of emotional regulation. Description of the role that reaction to novelty or anomaly plays in human information processing is clearly central to such a theory. A compelling body of evidence suggests that our affective, cognitive, and behavioral responses to the unknown or unpredictable are, quote, hardwired. Suggests that these responses constitute inborn structural elements of the processes of consciousness itself, we attend involuntarily to those things that occur contrary to our predictions, that occur despite our desires as expressed in expectation. That involuntary attention comprises a large part of what we refer to when we say consciousness. Our initial attention constitutes the first step in the process by which we come to adjust our behavior and our interpretive schemas to the world of experience, assuming that we do so. Constitutes as well the first step we take when we modify the world to make it what we desire instead of what it is currently. Just a side note, as I was reading that, it reminds me of something an old chemistry professor said to the class. He was trying to explain how important it was to come in on time, because we still have part of our brains are still lizard-like, and when something moves in behind him where the doors are or something like that, we hear and see something, we immediately look towards that, and our eyes shift and our attention shifts. It's like hardwired into us, and so Jordan's likewise explaining the so-called hardwired nature of how we react to what's in our environment, and particularly the things that we don't expect to be there are obviously the things that are not fitting into our model that we have to pay attention to, because they're not fitting into the model we have for our environment. Anyway, so modern investigation into the role of novelty in emotion and thought began with the Russians, E.N. Sokolov, O. Vinogradova, A.R. Luria, and more recently E. Goldberg, who adopted an approach to human function that is in many ways unique. Their tradition apparently stems from Pavlov, who viewed the reflex arc as a phenomenon of central importance, and from the Marxist intellectual legacy which regarded work, creative action, as the defining feature of man. Whatever the specific historical precedents, it is more definitely the case that the Russians have regarded motor output and its abstract equivalents as this critically relevant aspect of human existence. This intellectual position distinguished them historically from their Western counterparts, who tended to view the brain as an information processing machine, akin to the computer. Psychologists in the West have concentrated their energies on determining how the brain determines what is out there, so to speak, from the objective viewpoint. The Russians, by contrast, have devoted themselves to the role of the brain in governing behavior and in generating the affects or emotions associated with that behavior. Modern animal experimentalists, most notably Jeffrey Gray, have adopted the Russian line with striking success. We now know, at least in the broad outline, how we respond to those annoying, irritating, frightening, or promising things that we do not expect. That just reminds me of sort of two ways of attending to the world that Ian McGilchrist points out. And in a lot of ways, it seems like the Russians were focusing on what you might say is a right hemisphere way of attending to the world with your affective, emotional responses, and the Western world was sort of thinking in terms of the left hemisphere, the objective, sort of mathematical, computer way of the machine way of working in the world. And Ian McGilchrist goes into how scientists, especially the neuroscientists, when they were studying the brain, looked at the brain as a machine. They used the machine model, and so they totally overlooked how it was interacting with the world, and not the mechanical how. They understood, they were looking for the mechanical how, but in the way in which it was working in the world. There were two different ways of attending, of focusing your attention on the world. The pioneering Russian psychophysiologist Ian Sokolov began work on the reflex basis of attention in the 1950s. By the early 60s, his work had advanced to the point where he could formulate the following key propositions. First, our possible approach to analyzing the process of reflection is to consider the nervous system as a mechanism which models the external world by specific changes that occur in its internal structure. In this sense, a distinct set of changes in the nervous system is isomorphic with the external agent that it reflects and resembles. As an internal model that develops in the nervous system in response to the effect of agents in the environment, the image performs the vital function of modifying the nature of behavior, allowing the organism to predict events and actively adjust to its environment. And second, my first encounter with phenomena which indicated that the higher divisions of the central nervous system's form models of external agents involved the study of reactions to novel stimulus features. I characterized these reactions as orienting reflexes. The particular feature of the orienting reflex is that after several applications of the same stimulus, generally 5 to 15, the response disappears, or as the general expression goes, is extinguished. However, the slightest possible change in the stimulus is sufficient to awaken the response. Research on the orienting reflex indicates that it does not occur as a direct result of incoming excitation. Rather, it is produced by signals of discrepancy which develop when afferent, that is, incoming signals, are compared with the trace formed in the nervous system by an earlier signal. Sokolov was concerned primarily with the modeling of events in the objective external world, assuming essentially that when we model facts. Most of the scholars who have followed his lead have adopted his central assumption, at least implicitly. This position requires some modification. We do model facts, but we concern ourselves with valence, or value. It is therefore the case that our maps of the world contain what might be regarded as two distinct types of information, sensory and affective. It is not enough to know that something is. It is equally necessary to know what it signifies. It might even be argued that animals and human beings are primarily concerned with the affective or emotional significance of the environment. Along with our animal cousins, we devote ourselves to fundamentals. Will this new thing eat me? Can I eat it? Will it chase me? Should I chase it? Can I mate with it? We may construct models of, quote, objective reality, and it is no doubt useful to do so. We must model meanings, however, in order to survive. Our most fundamental maps of meaning, maps which have a narrative structure, portray the motivational value of our current state, conceived of in contrast to a hypothetical ideal, accompanied by plans of action, which are our pragmatic notions about how to get what we want. Description of these three elements, current state, ideal future state, and means of active mediation, constitute the necessary and sufficient preconditions for the weaving of the most simple narrative, which is a means for describing the valence of a given environment in reference to a temporally and spatially bounded set of action patterns. Getting to point B presupposes that you are at point A. You can't plan movement in the absence of an initial position. The fact that point B constitutes an end goal means that it is valenced more highly than point A, that it is a place more desirable when considered against the necessary contrast of the current position. It is the perceived improvement of point B that makes the whole map meaningful or affect-laden. It is the capacity to construct hypothetical or abstract endpoints, such as B, and to contrast them against the present. That makes human beings capable of using their cognitive systems to modulate their affective reactions. The domain mapped by a functional narrative, one that, when enacted, produces the desired results, might reasonably be regarded as explored territory, as events that occur there are predictable. Any place where enacted plans produce unexpected, threatening, or punishing consequences, by contrast, might be regarded as unexplored territory. What happens there does not conform to our wishes. This means that a familiar place, where unpredictable things start happening, is no longer familiar, even though it might be the same place with regards to the strict spatial location from the objective perspective. And just to interject, that's where you might say a good example is might be if you're familiar with, again, Owen Benjamin. A lot of people on my channel are familiar with him, so that's why I'm referencing him. When he had to move out of upstate New York, where his brother was living, and so that town was sort of like almost like another hometown for him, and it was a sort of like a heavenly place compared to where he was in California. Then when the chaos started to erupt there, all of a sudden everything was turned upside down, and that explored territory turned into unexplored territory, as we are reading here. And so I'll continue. We know how to act in some places and not in others. The plans we put into action sometimes work and sometimes they do not work. The experiential domains we inhabit, our environments, so to speak, are therefore permanently characterized by the fact of the predictable and controllable in juxtaposition with the unpredictable and uncontrollable. The universe is composed of order and chaos, at least from the metaphorical perspective. Oddly enough, however, it is this metaphorical universe that our nervous system appears to have adapted. And I quoted that on Twitter, and it started a very long discussion between a couple of people really getting into the philosophy of Jordan Peterson. And I know one of them believed he's a particular type of idealist. And I don't like to get into philosophical discussions on Twitter just because I find it just impossible to lay out your ideas and your claims and arguments in such a short amount of space, and then you have to start doing multiple tweets and numbering them, and I don't like how the threads are set up. It's not easy to follow individual threads. So God bless those two guys or girls or whoever they are arguing about the philosophy of Jordan Peterson. But it was just this little line that I quoted, and I just think it's really interesting now that you can see it in contrast. I know one of the people who said he thinks Jordan's some kind of idealist, said he read Maps of Meaning 3 times carefully. And here I am only on page 23, and I'm reading it along with my weekly series, so I'm not reading ahead. I'm learning it as I go here. And I do not get the sense that Jordan Peterson is an idealist. So maybe if you're into philosophy and you know what that means, you can let me know in the comments below. What Sokolov discovered, to put it bluntly, is that human beings and other animals far down the phylogenetic chain are characterized by an innate response to what they cannot predict, do not want, and cannot understand. Sokolov identified the central characteristics of how we respond to the unknown, to the strange category of all events that have not yet been categorized. The notion that we respond in an instinctively patterned manner to the appearance of the unknown has profound implications. These can best be first encountered in narrative form. I kind of am rushing through that last sentence because this video is going on longer than I expected it to, but I guess when you're reading 3 pages of Maps of Meaning, that might happen. I also wanted to touch on a little bit from a book Jung wrote, because I think it sort of it's good to sort of juxtapose these two things, seeing how much Jung influenced Peterson. This is from essays that were compiled into a book, Modern Man in Search of a Soul. And so this is, I believe, chapter 6, Freud and Jung, contrasts. So Jung says, I regard he's talking about how he gives positive value to all religions and the symbolism and rituals there, in these religions. Sort of, he's seen help his patients and so forth. And then he says, I likewise attribute a positive value to biology and to the empiricism of natural science in general, in which I see a Herculean attempt to understand the human psyche by approaching it from the outer world. I regard the Gnostic religions as an equally prodigious undertaking in the opposite direction, as an attempt to draw knowledge out of the cosmos from within. In my picture of the world, there is a vast outer realm, and an equally vast inner realm. Between these two stands man, facing now one and now the other, and according to his mood or disposition, taking the one for the absolute truth by denying or sacrificing the other. If you want to think about that in regards to everything you heard Peterson talk about, order and chaos and dreams and sacrifice, I think there's a lot that has to go in there. And then he goes on to talk about Freud and how Freud sort of was very single-minded in terms of boiling all human motivations down to a sort of sexual impulse. And so this, Jung says, this hopelessness would drive one to exclaim with Paul, quote, wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from the body of this death? And our man of intellect comes forward, shaking his head, and says in Faust's words, quote, thou art conscious only of the single urge, namely of the fleshly bond leading back to father and mother, or forward to the children that have sprung from our flesh. Quote, incest with the past and incest with the future. The original sin of the perpetuation of the family situation. There is nothing that can free us from this bond except that opposite urge of life, the spirit. It is not the children of the flesh, but the, quote, children of God, who know freedom. In Ernst Barlach's tragic novel of family life, The Dead Day, the mother Diamond says at the end, quote, the strange thing is that man will not learn that God is his father. That is what Freud would never learn, and what all those who share his outlook forbid themselves to learn. At least, they never find the key to this knowledge. Theology does not help those who are looking for the key, because theology demands faith, and faith cannot be made. It is the truest sense a gift of grace. We moderns are faced with the necessity of rediscovering the life of the Spirit. We must experience it anew, for ourselves. It is the only way in which we can break the spell that binds us to the cycle of biological events. So if you'd like to see how Jung is sort of flowing through Peterson, I think those are a couple of relevant passages. Just caught my eye as I was flipping through. I was rereading that book that I'd read a couple of years ago as I was reading this Maps of Meaning section. And of course, you know, you can hear Jung coming through Peterson in many, many ways. So if you enjoy listening to Maps of Meaning and maybe some Carl Jung, and I'll throw in some Ian McGilchrist now and then, please give this video a like and subscribe. Thank you.